Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Pat McDowell, and I'm committed to bring you ideas and resources that will enhance your professional development plan. Well, I had a fantastic conversation in this episode with Michelle Shumate, who brings great experience in a topic that is frequently discussed amongst nonprofit leaders, and that is alliance building. Of course, my first reaction to this topic was, well, of course, nonprofit alliance building is a good thing. We hear that as leaders. We talk about collaboration with our funders. But Michelle helped me, and she will help you better understand the complexity of strategic alliances and help you take a more strategic approach to the topic. As you might have guessed, alliance building is not always a good thing for you and your nonprofit organization. Michelle's going to help us all, first of all, understand what exactly is a good alliance. How do you know it when you have one? And what should you do if you see an opportunity for an alliance or a network in your community that can combine resources of yours and other nonprofit organizations? Michelle's been there. She's studied it. She's going to help you dive into this topic even better. Don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode. It's number 160. Just go to the podcast or the news page at patandmcdowell.com, and you'll find out all about the resources Michelle and I discuss, where you can find out more about her and the great work she's doing at Northwestern University, in particular through her Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact organization. She's also, in fact, written a great book that you need to get a copy of. It's called Networks for Social Impact. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Michelle Shumate. Michelle, thank you for joining me on the path.
Nice to be here.
I'm delighted to have this conversation because I admit, Michelle, in my nonprofit journey, I've always thought of alliances and collaboration as magic and positive words in terms of nonprofit leadership. But you've done some fantastic research on that exact subject. And I guess it's not always the case that alliances is a good thing. And I wonder if you could speak to that. Why aren't alliances always a good thing for nonprofit leaders to consider?
I love that question because I think so often we get the message that collaboration or alliances are a good in of themselves, right? And I don't think that's always true. I think that it depends a bit on what the alliance is designed for. If it's an alliance that is supposed to benefit the nonprofit organizations involved by reducing costs or reducing risks, something like a back office collaborative, then it only pays off if it actually does that, right?
Good point.
But so many alliances are designed for making a social impact. And the truth is, alliances and networks are a more expensive way to make a social impact than having an independent nonprofit do it on its own. It takes more coordination. It takes more leadership. It's another layer of administrative costs. And so for me, we have to think about how to design alliances so that they actually pay off, in that the network or the alliance does more than the individual organizations in that group could have done by themselves.
Love that. We're going to unpack it because, again, I think you've got our listeners' attention already. And I think many of them, as I know you can better explain, maybe went into alliance building because they thought they had to, or a funder told them to, or some other motivation that perhaps was not the best reason to do it. But Michelle, how did you come to this type of research? And you obviously have dived in very deeply into this kind of work. What led you to it? And did you experience firsthand some of these alliance issues maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I started in the nonprofit space primarily because I grew up as the daughter of a faith leader. And so I kind of early on, it got instilled in me that a life of service is one of the highest callings you could have.
Right.
And, fast forward, I went and got my master's and PhD at the University of Southern California, which we were talking on a little bit before we got started here. That experience led me to do research for a while in knowledge management. And I was doing knowledge management research in one of the largest engineering firms in the world. One of the things we found in that engineering firm was that they had reinvented and resolved their most complex problem 8 times. Now, why did they solve it the 8th time? Because they didn't know they had solved it the other 7, right?
Wow. Right.
And so that was great. It was a really fulfilling work, but at the same time, I got that little voice in my head saying, "Where's the service?" Right? And I was doing volunteer work. I was working with individuals experiencing homelessness in Hollywood, and I was doing that in my volunteer time on the weekends. But I felt like I needed to be able to do more. And then I just had this light bulb moment that most nonprofits aren't big enough to lose the solution to their most complicated problems 8 times internally.
Right.
But it didn't mean that the nonprofit down the street wasn't reinventing the wheel. And it was certainly something I was experiencing as I was volunteering and working with organizations in Hollywood, is that sometimes we had a great solution in one nonprofit. You go to a next nonprofit and they would be struggling with that problem. Right. And so I began to think about how can we bring organizations together so that we all get better. And that's led me on a journey for the last 20 years now. I can't believe I'm saying that,
Time
but for
flies.
20, right. I've been working with nonprofits and their networks, trying to help them figure out how do you design these in a way that's intentional and that actually pays off.
Fascinating. And again, that's why I'm excited about the conversation, because you do see opportunities for successful alliances, but you also can help warn us, frankly, as leaders in the nonprofit community, where we could spread ourselves too thin, frankly, or move into a direction that's not ultimately going to benefit the mission of the organization. Now, tell me about this, Michelle. You're teaching at Northwestern. You're also involved in the Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact. What are you teaching, and what is the Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact?
I like to tell my students I have one hat. It just has a lot of different names. So I teach undergraduate students all about nonprofit organizations, and from what is a nonprofit all the way to what does it mean to govern a board, and how do you do great communications work so that you're effectively communicating with donors and stakeholders. At the master's level, I do that as well. And so I spend a lot of time talking about nonprofit leadership. And I do that some in executive education courses through the Kellogg School of Management here at Northwestern. And then my PhD students are all out there researching wonderful nonprofit networks and taking the field further. And so it's really delightful to be able to teach in the sector, to be able to do research in the sector. And I also have a vibrant consulting practice where I get to work with wonderful nonprofit leaders and networks and helping them implement some of what I've learned.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's why I'm, again, delighted to introduce you and your work to some listeners who perhaps aren't aware of it. And I'm sure after this conversation may want to explore it further. Now, what is the Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact? What is that like, and how did that come about?
I founded the Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact when I came to Northwestern. It's my research lab. And so that's where I bring together interested undergraduate students and faculty and PhD students to go after some of these big thorny questions.
That's excellent. Well, that's a perfect segue to my kind of unpacking your research. What do you see are the critical tools that leaders need to be aware of or to manage as they begin to evaluate effective networks?
Yeah, I love working with nonprofit leaders, and I especially love working with network leaders as they're trying to manage these collaborations, because I think many times we think that it's the same tool set, right? If you've run a nonprofit, you surely can run a network. And time again, I've had network leaders tell me, oh, this is so much harder than running an individual organization. And there's a number of reasons why. I mean, some of it is that a network leader has all of the responsibility and none of the power allowed to be able to do things. They have to rely on organizational leaders to give of their time and discretion and volunteer. And often those leaders around the table are doing it as their second gig or third gig. I mean, it's not their primary job to do the network's work. They have a full-time job and organization and board they're responsible to. And so they often are wearing 2 hats at that table. So when I think about the tools network leaders need to create and manage networks, I tend to think about this in terms of the big challenges that they face. So one of the big challenges they face is really figuring out how to set up a network. And the first thing to do is to really know that there's no one way to do this.
Right.
There's several great pathways. There's some not great ways to do this, but there's not one way to do them. And in order to set up a network, I think the first thing to really think about is what role you want to play. I was involved in a network that was trying to be initiated by United Way. And they were going to do a cradle to career education network for our municipal county. And they got to the point of they had gotten all the decisions made about how to set up this network. And then they got to the question of, well, what's our role going to be in it? And it was really late in the process to ask that question, because the answer was everyone else assumed, oh, you're leading this thing. Right. And it wasn't what they were doing at all. They didn't want to lead it. So I always tell network leaders who haven't started the network yet, first, count the cost, figure out what role you want to play in it. And then second, use some really great tools to identify who needs to be at the table. And part of that is using a root cause analysis kind of tool to be able to figure out what's really the problem under the problem. Some of the reasons why you need a network is that problems are complex and your organization can't handle all the aspects of it. So you need to know who else owns parts of the problem, and can you get them to the table? And then the last thing I'd say is around creating a network is you need great negotiation skills. So you need to understand in the beginning around shuttle diplomacy. And that's almost always how networks get started, is shuttle diplomacy. You go to one organization and you say, would you be a part of the network? Here's why I think you should do it. This could be really great. And they say, oh, that would be great. Is so-and-so doing it? Because we would be in so-and-so is. And then you go to the next organization, you say, I just had a wonderful conversation. Let me tell you about this idea. So there's a lot of negotiation in the early stages. So having those kind of tools around shuttle diplomacy and really deep listening, being able to get to a consensus and help everybody get to a win. I think those are the most important tools you need for creating a network.
That makes perfect sense. And of course, if you don't find those things in place, then that is obviously a signal that maybe it's not the right thing to pursue it. Because to your earlier point, especially, I would imagine that nonprofit leaders, they're well-intentioned and they're dynamic enough to lead a community initiative. But I'm guessing you see often they bite off more than they chew, right? Or they risk diminishing their own organization's effectiveness because they've taken on more than they can handle.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when nonprofit leaders step in and they want to lead a community initiative, they want to lead a network, I often encourage them, just give a commitment of time of 6 months to a year where you're just going to see if this has feasibility first.
Got it.
Before you go all in. Because one, it's going to take your most important resource as a senior nonprofit leader, your time. It is time you're working on this network. It's time you're not spending fundraising. It's time you're not spending on operational development. It's time you're not spent on evaluating your own programs, right? So this has to pay off. You should do your due diligence, and you're going to need 6 months to a year to figure out if this is going to work. And then after that, you may find, okay, yes, this is going to pay off. We're going to be able to scale our work in ways that we could not have even dreamed of had we not stepped into this. Or it's okay to have an off ramp and say, there's not enough on the table here to justify the cost, the cost of my time, the cost of the staff, the cost of the money that's going to come in, the donors I'm going to have to contact for the network as opposed to my organization.
That makes perfect sense. But again, you could then face the community, so to speak, and say, we tried it, right? Yep. And I'm speculating here, Michelle, and I'm curious what your research found, but speculating that often funders put, two ways to say it. Either they encourage this or they put pressure on this that, hey, there are 4 organizations in town doing similar or related mission work, so surely they should come together in an alliance. Is that, do you think, the source of some of the pressure sometimes alliances start?
Absolutely. So when I work with with organizations who have a funder at the table, and the funder has acted as a convener of the network.
Right.
They may not have necessarily chosen every person at the table, but a lot of their grantees are there. I do a couple of things. One of the things I tell funders is you are not allowed to come to these meetings. I've had to kick a funder out of the room. They're like, I have some things to say. I'm like, no, you don't. You have nothing to say here. Like the one organization, one foundation, I really love the way that they did this is the Garfield Foundation. They established the REAMP network here in the Midwest, which is are all about equitably reducing carbon emissions. And so it's trying to combat climate change. When they originally started that network 10, 12 years ago, they brought together 10 partners and they said, here's the amount of money to see if it's possible for you to get together and build something.
Got it.
So give them seed funding, not for building a network, but for the feasibility.
Just finding to evaluate it.
Evaluate. Is there something here? What would it look like? And they didn't determine the conditions of it. And out of that, a beautiful network of 200 organizations across the Midwest working on this have arisen and are doing really remarkable social impact work. But they got the ball rolling, but they didn't determine its trajectory, right? And I've been in many, many other cases where a funder wants to determine its trajectory too. We were working with a network in Lusaka, Zambia. It was a gender-based violence network, and it was actually started by a international development agency.
Right.
And they set out the terms of that network. And this is what I saw time and time again. It's the same thing I saw here. The organizations would participate, and they would do exactly what the funder had required them to do, and exactly no more. Right? It became almost a compliance to be in the network, but none of the beautiful benefits that you get out of the network, that kind of whole is more than the sum of the parts kind of moment where you realize, actually, we could even do more together. Here's how we can develop synergy. None of that was happening. They might as well have managed all of those partners separately.
In other words, if the funder puts undue influence, then obviously we're not going to achieve the full potential of the alliance that you could envision happening. Is that kind of the danger of the funder?
Yeah, that's how I think about it. And so I was thinking about in that same, in gender-based violence and in that same town in Lusaka, there was another grassroots coalition, mostly local organizations. They formed it just because they wanted to. And it was amazing the amount of innovation and shared vision and social impact that they were having, because everybody who showed up at the table saw we need each other.
Right.
They didn't just see the funder wants us together.
Yes. But Michelle, we need funding, or are there scenarios? I'm just imagining the capacity of a larger alliance and the infrastructure. So where do we want funders to play in this? If they see the alliance and they see it's working, can they play a role?
Absolutely. And there's, at least in our research on these networks, a few ways that they do that successfully. Once we've got the alliance up and running, right, we're past the feasibility phase. Right. I think funders can play a much bigger role, and they can do it in a few ways. One is that some funders come in and they commit long-term to networks. It's because they recognize that social impact work doesn't happen on a 3-year grant cycle. And so they make long-term operational kind of commitments to the network because they can see the value that it's bringing to these organizations and to the communities they serve. Sometimes there's a funders table even that sits in the network where a group of funders collaborate together in order to provide some guidance to the network and to provide joint funding. And that's becoming more and more common these days. My most innovative model that I've run across is a little cradle to career education network that all of the partner agencies actually put money into the network. They don't need any external funding. Occasionally an external funder comes along and does a little capacity building work here or there, but it's being sustained by the members of the network. And so that's been really interesting to see. And I think maybe a more sustainable solution for some networks than going after the big foundation or philanthropic money.
Makes perfect sense. And I guess that would be a characteristic of a successful alliance, right? If it can be funded internally, so to speak, that probably illustrates it was a good idea. And again, but back to your point, funders can play a part in maybe funding the feasibility study They can fund it after we've got it up and running. But again, the danger characteristics or the danger zone would be a funder trying to literally influence the trajectory. Is that?
Yep, exactly right.
Okay. All right. Well, you've got a great book out there called Networks for Social Impact. Talk about that. Why did you write it? Or is it a culmination of many of the research kind of projects you had done prior to that? Tell our listeners more about it.
So we wrote Networks for Social Impact, and my co-author is Kate Cooper, who I've worked with for a number of years, because we are trying to solve two problems. One of them was a more academic problem, which is that you can find a lot of research out there on this topic if you know which journals to dig into and you know which fields study what. But that for the average nonprofit leader is a quagmire. Like we don't have time for that, right? Right. I wanted so much of that research that even wasn't my own to become accessible to nonprofit leaders, because I would have so often, go to a conference and I would be sitting around a lunch table and somebody would tell me about a problem they're having in their network. I'm like, there's research on that. Let me tell you some more. And so this book in part answers the question, well, what research is there out there on that? Nice. And it goes from, the basics of, what do we mean by social impact, and to how do you set up a network? How do you manage power and conflict and funding? How do you manage change? All of those are issues that there's a good bit of research on. Now that includes our own research for the last 20 years. And so that gets featured in the book, in addition to some illustrative cases, because I've always found that it is better to tell a story than simply give you a principle. And so we have 40 original cases where we've interviewed network leaders from around the country, including some Lodestar Collaboration Prize winners, to learn about what they did effectively, and you can hear their stories there.
Fantastic. And you're right, it becomes a one-stop shopping, doesn't it, for someone who wants to understand more, get a better sense of what research is out there, because you've put it together for us, as well as, of course, the great value of your own work. And you've touched on this to some extent, Michelle, but if I'm in a community, and what are the characteristics I should be looking for? I'm a nonprofit leader in a community. I think there's alliance potential, but are there certain key characteristics, again, that you would recommend someone kind of identify before moving forward?
So I think there are really three big choices that somebody has to make whenever they're looking for the potential of it. One is there the potential to build trust among the partners? So I've worked with networks where we've brought together partners who have been spinoffs of one another, or where there has been animosity between organizational leaders. Those are tough. Right. Like I would not sign up for that willingly if I was a nonprofit leader. Those are really difficult, but networks move at the speed of trust. So if you've got folks who already have some kind of good working relationship, it doesn't have to be a deep one. That goes a long way to being a good precondition for setting up a network. The second question is really identifying what's the value add of the network. How is it going to get to social impact? And there's a lot of different types of networks that you might be building, but figuring out which one it is going to be kind of key. So there are networks that are really project oriented. Maybe you've got a great project that you're trying to put together, or you're doing a joint capital campaign for some part of the city's betterment. The Chattanooga Museums Collaborative did that. They had a joint capital campaign to redo the riverfront in Chattanooga. Oh, wow. Right. Are you doing Catalyst? Are you trying to scale up? Right. That's a second piece. Like you've got an effective practice. You want to take it to the next level, to a different geography. There are networks that are really advocacy based, right? And they're all about, can we raise our collective voices to make a joint impact? That's great. There are networks that are really about learning. So can we all do our services and programs better as a result of that? And that one takes a minute for folks to figure out, because they're like, well, yeah, we're already always learning. Why do we need a network for that? My favorite example of that is actually the Chicago Benchmarking Collaborative here in Chicago, where I live. And it's a group of organizations that came together. They're all adult and early childhood serving organizations. They don't serve any of the same clients, totally different sets of clients, right? Right. But they came together to learn. So they created apples to apples kind of measurements for what a successful early childhood and adult education program looks like. And they benchmark their results against each other. And then they set up an improvement plan every year for each organization. They submit what they're going to do and focus on. They cite the data and how it compares to the others in the network. And then they figure out, based on who's doing this really well, what are they going to try out that somebody else is already doing?
Very
and
interesting.
that learning makes everybody get better, right? Like, so that's an opportunity for a network to get together that folks don't usually think of. And now there's all of these systems alignment networks that are coming up. And so some folks are familiar with systems alignment networks in terms of continuums of care networks in communities that address chronic homelessness. Areas on aging have a similar kind of systems approach. The one that I'm working with right now are America Serves networks that are around the country, serve veterans, transitioning service members, and military families.
Right.
And they bring together organizations that have 21 categories of services. And the idea there is that a veteran or transitioning service member or family member will never be told no by the network. There's not a wrong door. And they're on average, when a person puts their hand up and says they need help, they receive services within 48 hours. And their successful closure rate, meaning that person actually receives the services, they go all the way through their enrollment process for all those, is over 80%.
Love that.
That's an amazing type of network. Nobody's there is doing anything differently than what they were doing before. Like, there's no additional program.
Right.
It's all about that connection, that infrastructure that allows them to make referrals seamlessly. And so that might be an opportunity. So figure out what the value add is. Are you after a project here? Are you after a policy initiative? Are you after learning? Figuring that out. That's the second category of things that I think folks should think about as a precondition. Being clear on that saves everybody a lot of time.
Makes total sense. Yeah, and I love that example of kind of the improved referral network. No organization, I guess, in that example, had to add program or create an additional complexity, but they now have a better network amongst all of them, right? So that the person that each of them is trying to serve is going to make sure they get the help they need.
And they found that they could do more together. I mean, it took a while to get them to kind of buy in when this idea was in its infancy. But now, on average, a service member who comes to their network identifies 3 needs. And most organizations aren't able to serve all 3, right? They know they have to rely on their partners to do it. And they can figure out, let's just do what we do best. And I can go and refer them to another organization who does this other thing that they do best.
Yeah, that is such a helpful illustration. And I'm learning from you what a good alliance will look like and feel like based on the examples you're sharing. And of course, that's what your book will help someone understand even more. I wonder, from your experience, do you need a neutral third-party facilitator, I'm guessing, at the feasibility stage? Or I guess if there's a level of trust, a local nonprofit leader could be the facilitator or initiator, or what would you say to that question?
I think it helps to get some technical assistance when you're sure that there's there.
Okay. Yeah. Good point.
So I think it's probably not worth your money to spend it on a facilitator in the very early conversations where you're just trying to see if there's, shuttle diplomacy, right? Where you're gauging interest. But once you start getting to the point of real negotiations where you're figuring out who's going to put what skin in the game, you're figuring out things like how are you going to measure results? You're beginning to think about how you're going to position the network's work as different from the organizations involved so that you don't cannibalize resources. Then it can help to have somebody with some expertise to provide some technical assistance.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. But I go back to your phrase that there has to be a level of trust. And so we can't facilitate our way through that if the organizations and their leadership. Do you find nonprofit boards complicate these things? I guess that's among the folks you would have at the table, or how would you kind of gauge the level of that leadership group in terms of these negotiations and conversations?
So when I go work with a network to get started, one of the things that we do is we create a memorandum of understanding. We create a document where we go through and lay out almost every decision that needs to be made. Like, how are we going to do our decision making here, right? Are we going to vote? Are we going to do consensus? We talk about whose logo goes where on what. We talk about who's going to put what funding in and what are the responsibilities of organizations, all of those things. And I tell them that the network is not really created until every single organization's board has approved it. And the reason why I think that's so important is that, let's be real, executive directors, superintendents of schools, city managers, they turn over.
Yep.
They go to the next job. And when you develop a network where you are relying on the core competencies of all of the participants, all of the organizations, you don't want the whole organization to leave with the executive director. Often you need them in order to be able to pull off the thing you're trying to pull off, or else you wouldn't have had them in the alliance in the first place. So you need to get board buy-in.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And again, further illustration of the kind of dynamic in a successful alliance that you need to see. And you touched on this, Michelle, but I guess one more in summary, the characteristics of alliances that aren't going to work. Tell us again, and perhaps I'm sure you've been in scenarios where you're thinking this has to work. Many of these characteristics are in place. The positive signs are there, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. What are the signals that, Michelle, it's not going to work out?
One of the signals is that they don't have a clear theory of change. There's been a number of times where I've sat down with a network leader and they've told me, oh yeah, we have a great network. Let me tell you about the quarterly meetings where we get together and we have lunch. And I say, you have a wonderful lunch club. But it's not a network. You're not going to make a social impact. Right, not the same thing. And I've even seen times in which the members have been co-located, like they've gone in on a space together, but there's been no additional planning other than there's a space. And so thinking through that theory of change and being super clear about it makes a big difference. Otherwise, you end up with any kind of crossroads moment a network comes to. If they don't have a theory of change, everyone looks around and goes, why did we start this again?
Yeah, why are we here? Right.
Mm-hmm. The second thing I've found, and this is a little bit later down the road, is that overemphasizing a single leader in a network is a recipe for disaster. So often networks end up having a lead agency or a champion who's kind of controlling everything. They might have even developed a backbone organization to manage the network, and they're carrying all the water. And what happens is if any of those, there's something that causes that organizational leader to leave, or there is a disruption in kind of the funding model of it, it all falls apart.
Not sustainable, is it? Right.
Not sustainable. In our research, networks who have multiple champions and more decentralized leadership are more likely to be resilient and survive a crossroads moment.
Makes perfect sense. Yep, makes perfect sense. Do you see, Michelle, you alluded to this, the kind of back office alliance or partnership. Do you see many examples of that? In other words, even if the missions aren't aligned, but simply we're going to do it for an efficiency and infrastructure standpoint, do you see alliances like that come about?
Yeah, I've seen a number of those actually work. And sometimes that's the way that alliances just start. And sometimes that's all they ever become. So in Wisconsin, there's an alliance of independent colleges and universities that operates pretty much like a back office collaborative and have done it for years. And they have saved a ton of money on pooling insurance and benefits, on office supply purchases. They've been able to go in on risk assessment kind of things. And it's been a great savings. They've saved hundreds of thousands of dollars for their members through that process. So I'm all for back office collaboratives. They're fantastic. And sometimes that's all it is. Sometimes that's the entry point to something else. So I mentioned earlier the Chattanooga Museums Collaborative. That one started as a back office collaborative where they realized, oh, there's 3 museums here. Maybe we don't all need an IT department. Right. Maybe we could just have one. And so they figured out how to consolidate IT, and then they figured out some benefit sharing that they could do. And so that became the place where they built trust. And then it became something more, and they started doing things like joint capital campaigns and joint projects. So yeah, I do see them quite often, sometimes as the end of themselves and sometimes as the beginning of something new.
Just being clear, though, what the ultimate goal is, right? I guess is as long as everybody is on that same page and not turning one thing that really isn't going to happen into something more.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, you have to be clear at the beginning. And, you can talk to leaders of back office collaborators who just say, this is a cost savings measure. If you want to join us, you'll save money.
That's it, exactly.
Right? That's the sale.
No more, no less, right? But it is what it is. And this is fantastic, Michelle, on many levels. And again, in addition, I think to a listener now, a nonprofit leader, they need to learn about this. It seems to me that's a takeaway I'm having, that I need to read your book. I need to be more aware of successful and not successful alliances. Is there any other advice you would offer someone in or thinking about nonprofit leadership that they need to consider along these topics?
The last piece of advice I like to leave folks with is have some hope that, in fact, that networks can make a social impact. And sometimes as nonprofit leaders, we've been in the trenches so long that we get a little cynical.
Yes.
But there's been a number of networks that I've worked with that are doing remarkable things. I've told you about a few of them. I'll give you one more, which is Agewell Pittsburgh, which is a collaborative around seniors and serving. It's a group of organizations that are serving seniors across a variety of needs. They've started working together and doing kind of systems alignment work and learning work. They've been doing it for a number of years. Their outcomes are 10 points above the national averages in terms of Medicare. So fewer of their seniors go to the emergency room. They stay in their homes longer. They have better quality of life. They have lower rates of depression. You can, in fact, make a bigger social impact this way. Don't give up hope. Don't get too cynical about it. Be smart. Do your feasibility, right. All the things we've talked about. But, also know that there is a lot of hope and there's a lot of potential here.
That's so well put. And of course, we teased this episode, Michelle, with, an alliance may not always be the answer, but it seems like your closing remark is, though, don't give it a chance, right? Just be smart and keep your eyes open as you explore it.
That's right.
Fantastic. Of course, Michelle, we're going to lift up your book. Our listeners need to get a hold of Networks for Social Impact. But I ask, as you know, every guest, has there been a book that's meaningful to you or has been meaningful to you on your journey that you might recommend to our listeners?
I love books, as you would suspect from the professor who writes them. Yes. So it's very hard to pick one. It's like choosing of my children, which one is my favorite.
Unfair question. I get it.
I really, though, when I think about works that have been transformative in my own work, Cal Newport's book, A World Without Email.
Oh, love it.
A really provocative book and has really transformed the way that I set up my work life. And so I really recommend that. And then if we're thinking about really measurement and figuring out if you are making a social impact, Measuring Social Change by Alnor Elbrim is fantastic. And so I can highly recommend that as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I will add both of them. Of course, I'm a big fan of Cal Newport's. That World Without Email is already on the shelf behind me. So I'm glad to lift it up with you to our listeners, as indeed with your book and the other resources you've recommended. And speaking of resources and getting to know you and your work, where can our listeners find out more, Michelle?
So a couple places. One of them is the website of the Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact, and that's nnsi.northwestern.edu. And there we have a blog. We have a little podcast mini series, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. And so that's a great place to go and just learn more if you're wanting to read more. And then I'm pretty active on LinkedIn as well. Michelle Shumate, just like it is my name, it's easy to find me. There's not a lot of Michelle Shumates out there, evidently. And so pretty easy to find me. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm Prof Shumate on Twitter. And so I'm a little more wonky on Twitter than I am on LinkedIn.
That's fantastic. Well, you and I share a bit of a unique name, so it's easy to find us on LinkedIn, at least, right? When our names don't necessarily match up with hundreds of others. So
that's right.
Thank you, Michelle. This is fantastic, and for joining me on the path.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Michelle as much as I did and came away with some practical ideas that can guide you and your organization to be more effective in alliance building in your community and beyond. Don't forget the show notes. They are available on our website, pattonmcdowell.com. You can find out more about Michelle, her book, and the other resources she lifted up in episode number 160. As always, please share this episode with just one other person on the path. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe by going to our podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com. Go to the follow button, follow equals subscribe, and you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday. And of course, if you like this episode, click on the episodes button and you can scroll through every one of now 160 episode conversations. Thanks again for all you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now. And keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'm going to keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.